Welcome to Gutsy Talks. I'm Rachel Larsson, your host, naturopath, and nutritionist, and I'm here to have real, honest conversations that can help you heal your gut, calm your mind, and fall back in love with food. Together with leading health experts, we'll dive into all things gut health and explore the deep connections between your gut and overall well-being, so you can feel empowered to take control of your health and live your best life. If you love all things gut health, follow me for more on Instagram at rachel.larson or head to rachellarson.com.au. Now, let's get into today's episode. Today's a very special episode, and it's going to be the first of many where it's going to be you and me. I'll be diving into what I've learnt directly from my own personal experience, clinical practice, and of course, what the research says. I thought doing these solo episodes every now and then can really share with you my niche, what I'm passionate about. And that is everything to do with bloating, IBS, SIBO, food intolerances, histamine intolerance. You know, there's just so much that I'm dealing with in clinic. And I wanted the chance for us to have a bit of a chat. Of course, I had to kick it off with IBS. I think it's the elephant in the room when we talk about everything to do with gut health and bloating. And it really feels like every second person has IBS. So I'm going to share with you exactly how many people have it. And ultimately, from this episode, it is about having exactly what you need to achieve food freedom and symptom freedom. Because what I know, and I know this from what I'm seeing and hearing in clinic, as well as what people are emailing and messaging me, is that the advice around IBS is total BS. It is based in restriction. It's based in how we can learn to live with our symptoms. And we're not talking about the occasional symptom. This is stuff which it stops when you track symptoms. It can have a huge impact on your quality of life. And the advice is still, this is just who you are. We also want to talk about the real underlying root causes of SIBO, because this is something that people aren't talking about. And again, my personal clinical experience and everything that you guys have been sharing with me is also confirming that, is that nobody is talking about the root cause. So I really want to give you all the information that you need to really start taking your current place of where you are, which may be one of food restriction, elimination, symptom management, and really transforming that into something that is sustainable, symptom-free, and full of yummy, delicious food. And I think that sounds pretty good, right? So let's start super basic. I want us to get a very clear understanding as to what the term IBS is. We don't want to go any further until we understand what it is we're talking about, because it gets thrown around a lot and there's different thoughts as to what it is. So it stands for irritable bowel syndrome, and it's a common functional gastrointestinal disorder, and it's characterized by abdominal pain, changes in bowel motions, and other symptoms like bloating, flatulence, and stool urgency. Now, what is really interesting about IBS is that the true cause of it is still not really known. It's a bit unclear. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't treat and support IBS, but because we do know the contributing factors, and that's kind of where a lot of what we can do, where we need to be focusing it. But what we call the etiology, it's still a bit unclear. Now, this is super. Oh God, when I saw this, I reckon this is even an underestimate as to how many people have IBS. And if you do a bit of a Google and go to different either research papers or different associations or things around IBS, you might get a few different statistics. But in terms of global prevalence of IBS, it occurs in 11% of people. So basically every 1 in 10 people globally has IBS. And it does occur in women more than men, and it tends to be something that occurs in people that are under the age of 50 as opposed to the older generation. Certainly doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but that's kind of where we're saying the bulk of where this issue lies. Now, I also read something, and again, this was me trying to get the true statistics. And I think what this highlights is that there isn't actually one statistic, and there's many reasons for that. But around 1 in 5 Australians have IBS. So even globally, where they're saying it's around 11%, Aussies, it's around 1 in 5. So that is a ton of us that are suffering with this issue, hence why we're doing this episode. You know how common it is, even if that statistic, it might be 1 in 4 or 1 in 8. Either way, there's a lot of people that have been given the IBS diagnosis and that are suffering. But what was really interesting in the 2025 State of IBS report was that to even get a diagnosis, about 26, 27% of people had to wait 5 years to get that diagnosis, which is why I think maybe the statistic around how many people have it probably isn't correct, is because there's people that have it that are probably still 2, 3, 4 years from getting that diagnosis. So that is a long time to be told you have IBS. And then, of course, there's the issue of, well, there's not really much we can do about it, which we're totally going to debunk today. Something else that that report found is that over 52% of people in this report found that the healthcare provider that they were talking to didn't actually mention anything about the gut-brain connection as part of their plan. And you will understand as to why that is such a disservice in terms of the management of IBS. There is multiple mechanisms as to where this mind-gut connection in our nervous system is a huge driving force in IBS. So to have over 50% of people not have that part of their plan is again such a shame. The last thing that the report found that I'm going to tell you today is that for just under 42% of people said that they had to advocate for themselves to receive an IBS diagnosis. That is exhausting. That is people saying, I know there's something wrong with me. Can we please do this test? Can we please do something more? Like we had to advocate for ourselves, which I'm so for. I am a big believer in self-advocation, but there's a point where you're like, why aren't you helping me? Why am I driving this bus? Where it really should be about a teamwork. And if not, it should definitely be in that practitioners, I guess, as part of their duty of care to help explore exactly what's going on. So 42% had to really drive that bus in terms of getting that IBS diagnosis. So that's, I guess, pretty staggering when you hear that. And which is why it's such a huge issue and something which I'm working with all the time in my practice is because it is, probably underdiagnosed and it's certainly undersupported. When we're talking about the symptoms of IBS, the abdominal pain, the constipation, diarrhea, or alternating bowel motions, bloating or distension, excessive flatulence, fatigue, and nausea. They are I guess, the classic signs of IBS, and where, you should be considering IBS as part of maybe that underlying cause if you have any of those. And of course, these aren't specific to IBS, which is why it can take a while to get a diagnosis. You think about abdominal pain, anything to do with bowel changes. Of course, that could be related to inflammatory bowel disease. It could be related to diverticulitis. It could be related to gastritis. There's a lot of differentials that go into play, and we're going to get into how we diagnose IBS. But just, this is kind of why gut issues we need to test. We can't make assumptions because there's just too much overlap in terms of the symptom presentation. I will say though, these are some alarm signs, so some red flags that you need to be taking more seriously and is probably, I guess, not IBS or IBS plus something else that you need to be saying, hey, I need my case to be taken seriously. I need investigations because this isn't right. So take note of these. These are going to be stool changes, particularly looser for over 6 weeks. So we could be looking at infections and things like that. We could be having an acute flare of an inflammatory bowel disease or diverticuli issue. Blood in the stool, like that is absolutely straight away go to your GP. They might say, and they might be investigated and they might be put down to hemorrhoids. In some ways, not a good thing, but in other ways, great. There's nothing more sinister at play here, but we cannot make that assumption. Rectal masses or abdominal masses. So if you feel or sense masses in these areas, you need to seek investigation for that. If there is anemia, that low iron, we also need to look further into that because it may not just be a case of you're not eating enough. We're looking at maybe the absorption factors that are responsible for that. And they, again, could be conditions of the gut that are not IBS, something else that we need to know. If there are raised inflammatory markers and fever, these could indicate more infection. If there is weight loss, there's a lot of conditions associated with this, from celiac disease, inflammatory bowel, even cancer. Again, not to alarm, but it's about taking these things seriously. And of course, if there is a history of bowel or ovarian cancer, these are sometimes things that are picked up too late because they are put down to something else such as IBS. And we don't want to just rest on our laurels and say it must be IBS. We want to make sure there's an investigation process, especially if there's family history involved. So when it comes to IBS in the diagnosis, it really is, I guess, a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that there's no acceptable biological marker that can be used to diagnose IBS. This is unlike celiac or unlike inflammatory bowel disease, where there is markers that say, yes, this is exactly what this is. And I should say for inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, they are different, but there is no acceptable marker that says this is an IBS. So what they use instead is a criteria called Rome 4 criteria. And you can look this up. It's a super simple thing that you will find. But what this is, it's related to symptoms experienced over a certain period of time. And you need to have a couple of them to basically get that IBS diagnosis. So it's one of exclusion. So again, this is why you might say, I've had my colonoscopy, I've had my gastroscopy, I've checked for celiac, and there's nothing else. I've been diagnosed with IBS, which is true in a sense where IBS, you're not going to see any of those things. You can still have celiac disease and IBS. But I guess there's that slight difference in that with IBS, they're not actually looking for a specific thing in terms of something on your blood results or something through a scope. So it's the Rome 4 criteria that you want to have a look into. Now, I will say that there is another test that has been around for a couple of years. It's not available in Australia. It used to be, but it stopped in 2022, and it's called an IBS smart test. This isn't something which your local GP will necessarily be testing for. And because it isn't tested in Australia, if you're out of Australia, this might be something you can look into. But for us Australians at the moment, it's not. But IBS smart testing is a type of blood test which is related to specifically IBS-D. So if you have diarrhea, if you have constipation, this is not the test for you. And what they're testing for is antibodies to substances called cytolethal distending toxin B, or CDTB, and antibodies to vinculin. And so this CDTB is a genotoxin produced by various gram-negative bacteria. So this test is really good if you're someone that has got that post-infectious IBS status where you had food poisoning and all of a sudden your gut's not right. And again, it's important to know that this test is only for people that had that diarrhea tendency, not that constipation. Vinculin is something else that they test for an antibody for, which is an antibody, just to recap, is your body's, your body's mounting an immune response to something. Vinculin is actually a protein that is naturally found in us, and it's crucial for healthy gut function. And it looks with nerve cell migration and other cellular processes. It's kind of complex and it does probably deserve a longer explanation. But when you have raised antibodies against CDTB and vinculin, there is a pretty good, probability that you have IBS. So if you test with this smart IBS and you have anti-vinculin antibodies and anti-CDTB, there's a 98% probability test that you have IBS. If you've got one or the other, it's slightly less. It's like the high 80s. But again, it's a bit of a test which isn't in Australia, but super worth noting. And it's really good for people that have got these recurrent issues, because especially with that vinculin antibody that we're testing and hopefully capturing, it is showing that there is actually an immune issue happening with your nerve cells in your gut, which can be something that is sustaining these IBS symptoms and other things like SIBO. I know that's a lot. So look it up if you're out of Australia. And even if you're in Australia, you can look it up. So it's the IBS smart test. Hopefully it comes back into Australia so we can be using that. So I was talking about different types of IBS. And just to be, I guess, super clear in terms of how it's classified, it's mostly classified by their stool pattern as per the Bristol stool chart. Also, look it up because it's really handy to be using if there's a practitioner saying, what are your stools like? What is your poo like? And you're like, oh, well, it's kind of hard, but then it's kind of soft, and it's just kind of mushy, and it's that is, first of all, you probably don't want to go into that much detail. Most people don't, even though that's the kind of detail that we need. And second of all, there is a much easier way to explain your stools, is looking at Bristol stool chart. And it uses a range of 1 to 7 to describe your stool consistencies. And that way, and if you're talking to a practitioner, you can say, I fluctuate between an IBS or a Bristol stool chart 4. Sometimes I'm a Bristol stool chart 1 or so on like that. Anyway, so side note, but really important that you look at that because it's a great one just to for your own peace of mind. But when we're looking at IBS categorization, we're looking at IBS-C, C for constipation, IBS-D for diarrhea, IBS-M for mixed, where you may fluctuate between constipated and diarrhea. IBS-U is actually where it's a bit undetermined. I don't see a lot of people that are like that because it tends to be one of these first three, where there's, I guess, that insufficient abnormality of stool consistency to meet the criteria. Most people I see with IBS have that, but that is something to worth note as well. And then the last one is post-infectious IBS or IBS-PI. And this is where they're determined that it was from an infection like a gastro or a food poisoning that has resulted in IBS. And I guess you can then still have IBS-D from that, but people often say I have post-infectious IBS, more relating to the origin of their IBS. So this is where it gets really cool because I want to start talking about the causes of IBS. And even though there's no one clear etiology of it, there are different drivers. And there are going to be 7 things that we talk about. And these are the 7 things that, bit of a spoiler alert, we need to be looking at in terms of treatment plans. And if you're someone who has IBS and your treatment plan isn't considering these 7 things, then it's not a holistic treatment plan. And this is potentially why you're like, why do I still have IBS and why am I not getting better? So the first thing I want to look at and tell you about is the dysregulation of the gut-brain axis. This is where we're looking at the bidirectional communication between the digestive system and the brain. And this is via the balance between the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest, our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight, flight, freeze, and our enteric nervous system, which is our gut nervous system. And our gut nervous system will be influenced in terms of how it works based off your own fight or flight or rest and digest. So they're kind of all working together, and the parasympathetic and the sympathetic are influencing your gut's nervous system. So when we're in a place of stress, this often leads to the overstimulation of your sympathetic nervous system or your fight, flight, freeze, and this disrupts the process of digestion. This makes total sense though. And I know that we are speaking about it in different podcasts. If you go back to any podcast, like there's a mention of this nervous system, particularly the balance between these two things quite a lot because it has implications outside the gut. But when we're in that sympathetic dominance, our gut kind of just gets neglected because we're telling our nervous system there's something else more important. Usually our gut in its primitive state will be thinking it's life-threatening. And so it's going to be directing blood and our energy into our heart and into our limbs. It's not thinking at that time that it's time to digest your breakfast because stress historically and primitively would be associated with a life and death situation, getting chased by a tiger, fighting another tribe, something like that. It's not thinking the email, the heavy traffic, the looking after children who aren't eating and aren't getting ready for school, a stressful, project coming up at work. That kind of stress, the body doesn't know, that doesn't know any different. So it just says, righto, digestion is just, we don't need to be digesting food right now. We need to actually be surviving. It is found that patients with IBS usually have an increased sympathetic nervous system dominance and down-regulated parasympathetic nervous system. So this is going to be significantly impacting motility, which in turn can then lead to that diarrhea, constipation, hypersensitivity, and all that. So when we're talking about how do we deal with our IBS and our gut, this is where the conversation does need to be around stress management. It's not sexy. It's boring. It's stuff you've absolutely heard before, but doesn't mean it's not true and doesn't need to be prioritized. Another thing related to that nervous system is this, and I guess this is the second cause of IBS, is that there's altered serotonin signaling. So serotonin we know as our happy neurotransmitter. It does also have a critical role in how it regulates our motility and how it stimulates our enteric nervous system. This helps us then initiate secretions and what we call peristalsis, which is that muscular movement which help moves food through the gut. So our serotonin has got a really big role in this process. It's found that the serotonin concentrations in IBS patients with constipation is decreased. So we've got less serotonin in our plasma for those that have a constipation proneness and increased with those with diarrhea. And that makes sense. If serotonin is like our signaling neurotransmitter and you've got more in it when you've got diarrhea and less in it when you've got constipation, that is going to be relating to how it's triggering and signaling your motility. There's also different types of serotonin, I guess, receptors where we're looking at serotonin 3 receptors, which is related to motility, secretion, sensation, and serotonin 4 receptors, which look at both excitatory and inhibitory effects. So again, it's about where they're working as well, not just how much is in the body. So serotonin is also something else that we need to be looking at in people with IBS. Psychopathology. Psychopathology is kind of similar to that stress as well, but it also we're looking at issues like anxiety and depression and just distress, which may not be considered stress, although distress, I guess, is a part of feeling maybe overwhelmed and stressed. And these psychological, problems have been found to influence the mind-gut connection or the gut-brain axis. This increases different hormones. It impacts mood. It impacts digestive motility, visceral hypersensitivity, inflammatory pathways, neuroendocrine pathways. There's a lot that these states of mind and psychological issues influence. The stress in IBS patients, there's been shown that there's more inflammatory markers and that there is a dysregulation of what we call the hypothalamus pituitary axis or the HPA axis. So we can see again that these nervous system and the psychological issues have a huge role. So that the first three are related to our nervous system. The fourth thing that causes IBS is visceral hypersensitivity. 2/3 of people with IBS have visceral hypersensitivity, which is huge. So 66% of people with IBS have this visceral hypersensitivity. And this means that the nerves that are in their gut, they are more sensitive to what is happening in their gut. So whether there is fluid or food or gas, that is going to be sending signals to their brain saying that there's more pressure in their gut, and that is going to it tells us that that's what's happening by experiencing pain or gut symptoms. And it was also linked that those that have stress as part of a causative factor have more hypersensitivity. So I guess once again, stress is not only its own issue, but it worsens the level of hypersensitivity that you do have. And people that have less serotonin, once again, the nervous system connection, are more likely to suffer with visceral hypersensitivity. So our nervous system is influencing how sensitive our gut nerves are to what is happening inside it. Sensitive to the point where anything can be in your gut and you're like, I feel something, which is not in your head. It is actually happening, but it is in your head in a sense where it is the mind and the gut talking to each other, but you're not imagining it. I'll make that very clear. This is actually happening in your body. The fifth thing that causes IBS is gastrointestinal infections. We spoke about post-infectious IBS was a diagnosis or a subtype of IBS. And a common example of this would be Giardia or Giardia. Mechanisms of this post-infectious IBS include that it's going to cause inflammation, it damages the mucosal immune cells, it damages our gut cells, it can cause damage to our gut nerves, and it changes our microbiome. So there's lots of different mechanisms as to how and why an infection will lead to an IBS and a post-infectious IBS status. What's really interesting is that there's an overlap, and we talk about infections and dysbiosis in the gut, is that there's an overlap with something called SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And this is also going to contribute to the development of IBS. SIBO can also be caused by a gut infection, like gastro or food poisoning or something like that, but it also has other causes as well. And there is a similar symptom picture with SIBO with our IBS-D and IBS-C people, because it's also experiencing people that have SIBO, that may or may not have IBS also experience discomfort and bowel dysregulation. So there's a big overlap between IBS and SIBO, and there's a study that gets quoted a lot, is that there was a study that showed that had IBS people participants, and there were some non-IBS participants in there as well, and they were testing for SIBO. And what they found is that 78% of the participants with IBS also had SIBO, and for those that didn't have IBS, 40% of them had SIBO. So I want to really highlight that, because you can have IBS without SIBO and you can have SIBO without IBS. What I find clinically in practice is that SIBO isn't tested enough. And that is, something which I understand many GPs don't recognize. It is something that is highly researched and is highly studied. So it's not just something made up. But this is where I think there can be, I guess, a bit of a gap in terms of understanding the drivers of IBS. Even if you don't have SIBO and you still have IBS, we need to rule it out, because SIBO is something that can be tested, it can be treated, and it can be cleared. And it deserves its own podcast. And it is the next one that I will be doing as our little date together. It will be going through everything about SIBO. So that will be one that will tie really nicely back in with this IBS. This is also, I guess, SIBO is, I guess, an example of alteration in gut flora, our alteration in our gut microbiome. But moving on to number 6, I just want to talk a little bit more about your large intestines and your large intestinal microbiome. So that's the 6th thing that can cause IBS. It is thought that up to 73% of patients with IBS also have dysbiosis. So that's like almost 3/4. Like, this is where we need to understand what is going on in your gut, not just say, just eliminate that food, because there are drivers here that we can understand, test, and support. Some hallmarks of this dysbiosis can be that there's decreased diversity in IBS patients compared to what we call healthy populations, or I guess those without IBS. There is decreased beneficials, and there's increased risk of opportunistic infections. So a bit later, I'm going to go into more specifics, but that is definitely something that we see in IBS people if we test their gut. Now, this one's an interesting one. It talks about food sensitivities being a bit of a cause for IBS, but I personally think they are often more of a consequence of IBS. Now, food sensitivities, which can be things like lactose and FODMAPs and those types of things, it is true that if you have an issue with those foods and you're eating them, that there will be a sense of intestinal inflammation, damage, and hyperpermeability in the gut, which can worsen those symptoms. There are people that have true lactose intolerances and true intolerances, but there are many people that have them as a result of having IBS, of having SIBO. This is where I find that the treatment and support around these issues fall short, because we focus on the removal of these foods as the treatment. Even though we know that it can be beneficial in symptom reduction, just removing these foods doesn't take into account the 6 things that I've mentioned before. So really important to know that, yes, it can contribute to that inflammation picture, but it can also be a result of having this issues with the intestinal dysbiosis and enzyme issues that then actually cause the issues with the food. I hope that's super clear, because I find that that's something that people can really get stuck on, is just focusing on that food removal. And it's really maybe a bit further down the path in terms of what's causing the issues, and it's actually more of a consequence. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be testing for things like lactose intolerance or those types of things, but it's just then about how we go about supporting that, as opposed to saying food removal, that is the only option. It's often not all we can do. And even if there's someone with a true sensitivity, there can be a lot of gut healing that we can do that can make their symptom picture better, have a bigger threshold in terms of what they can tolerate, which is really, I guess, a great thing to be looking at if you're wanting to just improve quality of life. So we know that there are some causes that we need to look at, but there are a few risk factors that increase our risk of that development of IBS. There is genetic predisposition that we know of. There are different SNPs on different genes that have been associated with IBS, and these can include things like serotonin signaling, different things related to our immune, different things related to our gut barrier, our epithelial barrier, how we create bile, our different pain receptors and those types of things. So there are a few genetic predispositions we can have. Even if you were to discover that you did have these genetic predispositions, that still shouldn't change your ability or your mindset in terms of your ability to improve your life quality. There is lots that we can do, even though we have the genetic predisposition. We talk about it in terms of epigenetics, but also just learning to live with our genes and just maybe consider these as more nurture points rather than we have to live in this current state of pain that I'm currently living in. There's a lot we can do, even if there was that genetic predisposition there. And in my experience, there's no one that's ever come with me having had these tested for. So I don't think this is in, I guess, part of that testing workup that would be wanting to get done. I think they're just saying that there are different things that they are knowing about our, I guess, our risk factors. Having a history of enteric infections, so food poisoning, travelers diarrhea, increases your risk. Being on different medications like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, antibiotics, the pill, like the contraceptive pill, can increase your risk. A history of stressful life events, and also past or present anxiety and depressive disorder. So these all increase our risk of developing IBS, which is why you might have had great gut for years, and all of a sudden you're like, my gut's not okay. And it can be this accumulation of these factors that you may not have been aware of, that were accumulating. And just something has, the straw that broke the camel's back kind of situation. This happens, and I see this a lot in my clinic, that people would be like, I feel fine, like I don't feel stressed. And then we dive into their history, and there is a big history. There's a picture of childhood trauma or something there. And that can be kind of catching up to them in a physical sense. So that's just worth noting, that you don't have to be currently an emotional wreck, as some people would think that they have to be. There can be historical events that are starting to catch up with you in your guts, your nervous system, that is now affecting your gut nervous system. Now, when we're getting into things like things that can make things worse for us, there are things that these are the BS things I want to debunk. First of all, the biggest issue I think we have when it comes to IBS is that there is a hyper focus on food. Now, by food, I mean food elimination and food restriction. Yes, there can be a place for these. In fact, we know that the study says that I think it was in the 86% of people that have IBSD, when they go on a low FODMAP diet, can feel temporarily better. There's no doubt that that helps, and it can help with that inflammation. And going on a low FODMAP diet for a temporary time is totally acceptable in terms of a standard way of working with IBS. The problem is that when we get stuck on that, because we're not being told how to transition from that, because other drivers aren't being considered, and we're looking at food like it's the enemy. Food is signaling that there is something still not right and working in our gut. Food itself is not the issue. Food is just triggering the issue within us. So I want the focus to be more on food inclusion. And this is what I support with all my patients that I work with and I teach in Bloated to Body Confident, is shifting that focus from food exclusion to food inclusion, because there are still a lot of foods that we can include. And it's really important that we focus on these, because we know that dysbiosis in the gut is something that causes IBS. And we know that one of the causes of dysbiosis is a restricted, unvaried diet. So we don't want to accidentally be supporting symptoms, but actually driving another underlying cause without us even knowing. So we want to focus on food inclusion as much as we can. And if someone is putting you on a form of elimination diet, you need to be feeling confident that there is the goal to get off it and that you're being supported holistically. The other thing that is making our gut worse is random supplements. Now, I couldn't even countless, millions, thousands, millions, I don't even know, on the internet and online, of people saying this is the thing to take for your IBS. What we know is that for us to be treating ourselves properly, we need to be knowing what we're working with. A generalized supplement that is skewed towards IBS may work for some people, but not others. When we have more information, we can support more specifically. So, choosing random supplements and even looking at things like antimicrobials, things that do like doing parasite cleanses, these can actually be causing more issues in your gut because they could be creating more dysbiosis in your gut. The last thing I see as things that people do that make their gut worse is that they just do not prioritize their nervous system. It is still all about diet and supplements. And I'm not saying that addressing your nervous system, especially if we're looking at years and decades of dysregulation, I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's necessary. And this is something which takes time, have every bit of self-compassion for that process because it takes a lot to start peeling this onion to really get down to where our dysregulation comes from and learning a different way as to how to live. And our nervous system and how we support it comes in many different forms. It's not just counseling or going to a psychologist. While they're totally helpful, there are so many other things that we can do. So when we're looking at IBS, this is where that nervous system prioritization needs to be up there. And I would say even putting it before and even more important than any diet or supplement that you do and follow. So when it comes to testing, we know that to get a diagnosis of IBS, it is the Rome 4 criteria that is ultimately used. I've spoken about how the IBS SMART test is something that people outside of Australia can look into if you fit that criteria of having a diarrhea predisposition and you're working with a practitioner that works for that. Other things that we need to consider testing, and this is where you might feel like I'm doing all these tests, but nothing's coming up. We can't afford to not test these either. And these things that I will look at first can be done through your GP or through a specialist. So depending on how you go, there could potentially be bulk billing or subsidized, or, these are things that aren't considered private. And that is pathology testing. You can get a lot from your pathology testing in terms of inflammation markers like ESR, CRP, getting a liver panel, looking at a full iron studies, a thyroid panel, B12, celiac serology, and genotyping. These are things that are making sure that there isn't nutrient absorption issues, that there isn't immune markers, or there isn't inflammation, or there isn't celiac going on, or if there is, they're picking up on it. So we need to make sure that we're looking at these other factors because that can tell us a lot about the gut as well. If I see someone with low B12 and low iron, I'm definitely thinking, okay, well, what's happening with their hydrochloric acid? What's happening is, do they have a SIBO status as well? So it does also help understand, I guess, a bit more of a functional picture of the gut as opposed to just looking for disease states. Of course, if appropriate, looking into scopes in terms of your colonoscopies or gastroscopies, we cannot just assume that it's IBS. There could very well be something more sinister at play. And usually leading up to that, there's indications of that, whether it be family history or other test results that you've got back. But these can be really good just to have peace of mind that you're like, great, there's nothing functional, there's no inflammation that's occurring that's affecting my gut lining in me. We can move on to other differentials and we can cross out a lot of those things that would be diagnosed through those tests. Moving on to some of the private things, private testing that I look at in my clinic and that I teach in Bloated to Body Confident. And I should say, I've mentioned Bloated to Body Confident. I'm not here to spruik that in a sense, but that is the way that I do support my patients. And it is a program that goes through all of these processes and testing and treatments in relation to people that have bloating that may or may not know their cause yet and ultimately achieve food and symptom freedom. The three tests that I'm looking at can be, and there are more, but the ones that I will mention today is the SIBO test, the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth test. It's a breath test, a comprehensive stool test, and this is one where you have to be super, super particular about the one that you choose. If you go back to earlier episodes, I think it was episode 2 with Dr. Brad Leach, and he's talking about the microbiome and the types of tests that you use, he will he will convince you as to why not all tests are made the same. We want to be using metagenomic stool testing, which is, I guess, the best type that you can get. And also, we want to be working with someone that can interpret that correctly. So we can have all the information in the world, but if it's not interpreted or applied correctly, the information is useless. This is also something that I look at in Bloated to Body Confident. But what could be looking at in someone that has a IBS status, and this is, I guess, more detail about what a dysbiotic microbiome looks like. We could be looking at reduced diversity and increased instability into in the gut, reduced production of short-chain fatty acids called butyrate and propionate, low levels of organisms called Akkermansia muciniphila, and you could have more higher levels of pro-inflammatory bacteria. And there are lots that we could consider, and a good metagenomic stool test would tell you exactly what that is. Something else that we could consider from a private perspective, meaning out of pocket that you'd have to pay for yourself, is intestinal permeability testing. So lactulose mannitol testing can be great at understanding, even after you've done all this gut healing and stool testing, is there still inflammation that needs to be healed? Because that's important to be like, is that still the missing piece that needs to be worked on? That's not the first test I do, by the way. It's a bit later on, because if you've got gut issues, there's a few other things that are probably more clinically helpful and applicable. So I guess the question is, well, Rach, you've mentioned all these tests. Do I need to, can I treat without testing? The answer is yes and no. Of course you can treat without testing, but have you not been doing that so far? I think of it like playing a game of darts or archery, whatever kind of target-based thing that you want to envision. So if you want to treat without testing, so no testing and no diagnosis, you're going to be about 1 meter off the target in terms of where you're working. You're going to be shooting an arrow, throwing a dart, and it will be landing nowhere near the target. If you have no test results, but you have a diagnosis, so let's say you do have IBS, you might get on the edge of the target. So you might just be kind of getting in the area that you need to be getting, because you've got that diagnosis of IBS, but you don't have any tests to give you any specifics. Then when you have testing with the combination of a diagnosis, or the testing can help you have the diagnosis, we are targeting the center of the target. This is where we can say for certainty, yes, we have SIBO. Yes, there's this specific type of dysbiosis. This is how we need to treat it. There are some things around IBS that clearly we can't test for, like the serotonin signaling, or, really the gut-brain connection dysregulation. There are things that there's not like a clear-cut test for that. There are things around cortisol, those types of things, but there's no like one test for that. So you can kind of support that sometimes without necessarily having tests, but there are lots of things that you do need the test for that help with that targeted treatment. So this is where, yes, you can treat without testing, but I don't advise it, because we need to understand so much more, and you will be wasting time, energy, money without those results. So when it comes to treatment, it needs to be a pronged approach. We need to be addressing all of the things that we mentioned, such as the gut dysregulation, but also things that come as a consequence of that, such as we need symptom relief. We need something that works for you right now, because we know that this stuff takes time. There is a great study that showed that using the peppermint enteric coated essential oil, and it had 72 people in the IBS-D and IBS-M, and there was a 40% reduction in their baseline symptoms in the areas of discomfort, bloating, pain at defecation, and urgency in those people. So 40% of those people had reduced issues with those just by taking enteric coated peppermint oil. I should also say that this isn't prescriptive to any particular person. I'm just kind of telling you the studies, that there are lots of things that we can do. We want to be looking also at things that improve digestive function, so transit time and peristalsis, or potentially enzyme production. We want to correct dysbiosis. We want to reduce intestinal permeability and inflammation. We want to support neurotransmitter function and creation. And we want to improve resilience and our stress response. We want to help adapt to that. So there's lots of things that you can do, such as gut-directed hypnotherapy, which could be a great thing to do. But you can tell that there's not just one thing that we need to do. It needs to be multifaceted. In terms of probiotics, While not all probiotics are made equal, the one that does have a great amount of evidence around it is Lactobacillus plantarum 299V. Again, this was a 4-week study with IBS people, and after 4 weeks, 78% of those with IBS taking that probiotic had a reduction in their symptoms, increased stool, or I guess not increased, but an improvement in terms of their stool frequency. And this is compared to 8% of controls. So those that were taking the placebo, I guess, of that probiotic, they found that yes, it was clinically significant that the probiotic did help. So it's a great probiotic to start with when we're looking at IBS because there's such great research around that. From a dietary perspective, I never want to prescribe a restrictive diet for people that have any issues with eating disorders. We also need to take into consideration your mental health at that state, even if it isn't specifically eating disorder related. We know that low FODMAP diets can help temporarily, but the temporary part of it is key. It is long-term, not what we want for your gut, and can actually add to more issues down the track. Other things that we could consider, again, it's on an individual basis, but reducing known aggravators such as caffeine, alcohol, carbonated drinks. They can be irritants and they can be a bit pro-inflammatory. If you are celiac, obviously you want to be gluten-free. We want to be actually including low FODMAP prebiotics such as polyphenols, resistant starches, and pectins. These are things that we can add, which is where we start to shift that mindset from exclusion to inclusion. And eventually, we want to get you on a fully diverse, highly variable, high fiber diet. That is the end goal. And the process to get you there may start actually from a place of eliminating some of those things for a short period of time, but working towards addressing those underlying issues so that you can eventually tolerate it. And I've seen that happen in my clinic. So this isn't just some fairy tale that I'm pulling out of thin air. Like this is something which my patients do achieve once we understand the hows and whys that they have these issues in the first place. And I think that's kind of a great segue into what is realistic about IBS in terms of the treatment and management. And the reality is that there is going to be a degree of ongoing management. And I don't mean that in a way where it's highly complex or that there's lots of different protocols to follow. But the truth is that nothing in our life, there is no health condition that is of this kind of chronic nature that is like once it's gone for good. You know what I mean? Like, unless you get that organ removed, like there's always the potential of something coming back. And that is just the nature of life. When we talk about these risk factors and these underlying causes that cause IBS, it is very possible that after 5 or 10 years, or even 6 months after you've got your IBS, if these drivers and causes and risk factors return, that your IBS will come back. And I don't say that to scare you. It is more about personal empowerment and responsibility, and that we need to understand how to look after our own body. We need to know what our drivers are. We need to know our underlying causes so that we can support ourselves ongoing. And that may be that you are someone that does need to take a digestive enzyme when you have a certain meal. You might be someone that's like, I feel so much better when I do a meditation every day. That could be part of your IBS preventative and sustainable strategy. Like these are things that we can't just revert back to what we did before. Otherwise, you will almost guaranteed get that. I don't like to talk in absolutes, but if you were to revert back to what you were doing when you were getting that IBS diagnosis, it is likely that it'll come back. So it is about having sustainable strategies in a long-term sense that address your underlying root causes, that you can continue, that doesn't feel like a hassle, that is your best bet for having that food and symptom freedom. Now, this has been a huge podcast, but I want to give you some things that you can start right now that will help your IBS. The first thing that we want to be doing is mindful eating. It sounds so simple. In fact, it almost sounds boring. I know that you wanted me to say you need to go out and get a metagenomic stool test. No, you need to be mindfully eating. You need to be thinking about how do we put our system in that parasympathetic state, that rest and digest state, especially around mealtime. And that can be things like chewing 20 times before you swallow, shutting your laptop, sitting under a tree to eat. Again, it sounds so unsexy, but this is the lifestyle stuff that honestly is worth its weight in gold. You can also, and what I love doing is starting to use herbal teas. Your digestive teas, ginger, chamomile, peppermint teas, they're great. They are super calming for the gut. Coming into winter, or even if you are going into summer, you can have them cold, but these are things that are actually working for our gut, making it calmer, less hypersensitive, can help our digestion. And it's just a herbal tea. You would probably be drinking water or coffee anyway. Add in a herbal tea there, and it will be doing wonders for your gut. And I've got people who, if they feel like they've maybe eaten something a little bit like, oh, I don't know if that's going to sit right with me. They pop on they boil the kettle, have a herbal tea, particularly peppermint. A lot of people find really helpful. And yeah, like they get through it really pretty unscathed. And if they do get a little bit of bloating, they're like, that's okay. It's super manageable. I just need to go to bed and it's all fine. The last thing that you can do right now is look into gut-directed hypnotherapy. Now, Nerva comes to mind as an app that is used a lot and spoken about a lot for good reason. It's really accessible and, it is a lot more accessible than necessarily paying for one-on-one appointments, which you can totally do. But if we're talking about right now action, you can download the app and do that. And this is where we're looking at how we can also support that mind-gut connection, which, as we saw, was such a huge contributing factor to IBS. So the last thing, and I guess this is my number one piece of advice, if you know you have IBS, you've been diagnosed with it, or you've just got a gut feeling that you've got IBS, my number one piece of advice would be to work with someone who will support you holistically. If you're working with someone that is treating at a Band-Aid level, you will never get past working at a symptom Band-Aid level. You'll always be looking at taking another maybe medication, taking another food out of your diet as a way of managing it. If you're working with someone holistically, this is where we can start to look at those underlying causes, where the real kind of magic happens. So that would be my number one piece of advice, is kind of not necessarily get rid of that person that you're working with today, but start putting out the feelers for someone who you think is more holistic in that approach. For me personally, who had 10 years of chronic illness, and that was working with that very symptomatic approach, that was the one thing that changed my life. So I feel very passionate about that. Now, if you want to work with me, this is how you can do it. Obviously, I'm going to put everything in the show notes, and you can connect with me on Instagram at rachel.larsson and my website, rachellarson.com.au. The links will be in the show notes. But the way that I help people achieve that food freedom, that body confidence, that symptom-free living is through Bloated to Body Confident. It is the program that I work with. It has been, my labor of love, putting all of my years of clinical experience, with patients, and also my personal experience into it. And it is really for people that have bloating, IBS and SIBO that do want that holistic approach. They want the testing, they want the targeted treatment, they want to be having that food inclusion mindset. So I'll put that down there for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I cannot wait to do another date with you on this podcast and share something else that I am passionate about. We will be back to seeing and interviewing a wonderful guest next time. But any questions that you have about IBS, please reach out to me. I cannot wait to connect with you. Until then, thanks so much. Thanks for tuning into Gutsy Talks. I hope today's episode left you feeling inspired to take the next step in your gut health journey. If you're ready to dive deeper, head over to rachellarson.com.au. There's a range of courses and resources waiting for you. If you loved this episode, I'd be so grateful if you shared it with others who might benefit from this information. And so you don't miss out on future Gutsy Talks, be sure to hit follow and leave a review. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'm Rachel Larsson, and I can't wait to connect with you again for our next Gutsy Talk.